So I remember, it's hard for me to believe this, but probably 25 years ago, I remember reading an article in the newspaper, and it was about this new thing that was happening on TV called reality television. And I remember being struck by this. This was a time when they were doing those reality dating shows where people would go and make fools of themselves, as far as I could tell, and it'd be filmed. They'd be saying the dumbest things. They'd be doing kind of things I can't imagine why they would be doing them. And I remember asking myself all the time, why would people do a reality television show? I couldn't understand why people would be attracted to making a fool of themselves on television, particularly on a date, which is hard enough. And then I came across this article, and it was this person, it was actually, I was in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time, and they were doing recruiting for a dating show, this reality dating show in Tulsa. And a reporter went to interview people, and it was a line that went around the block of people wanting to be on this reality dating television show. And again, I'm thinking, oh my God, why would you do that? Maybe I'm just shy, I don't know. But this reporter was interested in the same question, was asking people in the line, why are you doing this? Why do you want to do this? And there were various answers, but almost all of them came up with one answer, and it was simply, because I want to be famous. And I was struck by that, and then someone said a line which really hit me between the eyes. Someone said, I want to be famous. I want someone to know my name. And I was blown away by that, in part because I think their experience is an experience many of us have, or many people have in our society and culture, is that we don't belong enough anywhere that someone would know your name. And how sad it was that they had to go on a date in a reality television for people to know their name. Peter Block, in a book he wrote called Community, the Structure of Belonging, he asserts that the essential characteristic, the essential definition of community is simply the experience of belonging. And belonging is that sense of being related to a part of something. We know what it means to belong to something. It's a profound sense of home, as this place I belong to, as these people I belong to. But he points out belonging can also be a sense of ownership, as in something belongs to me. So belonging is both a connection and a claim. And Block asserts that the absence of belonging is so widespread these days, we might say we are living in an age of isolation. He points out that those we label as homeless or as an ex-offender or as disabled or as at risk are really only the most visible people who struggle with belonging in the midst of isolation and apartness. But the truth is, our lack of belonging is a wider condition of modern life. And one might say the crisis in many of our communities, from mental illness to addiction to mass shootings, could be described as a crisis of belonging. Now, years ago in this church, we had a small group here at Heartland who were exploring the question of what are we called to as a church and disciples. And part of our process, part of our discernment was we were sent out to ask members, to ask friends, to ask neighbors, even ask strangers in the community what they saw, what they experienced as the deepest need and pain in our communities. And many were the responses were what we expected, the things we might easily identify: homelessness and hunger and poverty and racism and climate change. But surprisingly, at least to me, the number one need and pain identified by most people was loneliness. And I suspect that this year following this year of COVID, that sense of loneliness, that sense of isolation has only gotten worse. Another story I'll point out. Years ago, I was involved. Presbyterians in the state of Iowa were wrestling with the questions, trying to get a handle on mental illness in Iowa. In our state, Iowa's kind of infamous for not having the resources to address mental illness in our communities. And so I got tasked with talking to the top mental health advocate in Polk County. And in my conversation with her, as she shared statistics and what the county was doing, I asked her, what's the best thing churches could do to help people who are wrestling with mental illness? And her answer kind of surprised me because it wasn't a big thing. What she said is, as she looked at me, she said, the best thing a church can do is welcome with generosity and hospitality those people struggling with mental illness. That for those who have those struggles, they don't have a place where they can belong. So at the heart of my reflection this morning are two questions. Two questions, probably the most important questions we can ask ourselves that we probably don't ask ourselves enough. And those two questions are, who do I belong to? And who belongs to me? Who do I belong to? And who belongs to me? Now, the passage that Drew read this morning, a very difficult passage. He did a great job. But it's a passage that's kind of, I have to admit that Paul is sometimes the hardest to understand. His theological language, it's dense, his images. He talks about law, and he talks about the flesh. He talks about all these different ideas. And in Romans, particularly the letter to Romans, is a letter that's filled with all these theological ideas. And I always tell folks that the best way to understand Paul is that really he's wrestling with those two questions. Who do I belong to, and who belongs to me? And in the few verses Drew read for us this morning, he states unequivocally, we belong to God. Now, that may seem a trite thing to say, but what he's trying to assert when he talks about and uses terms like don't be trapped in the captivity of flesh, what he's trying to assert is don't be trapped to believe that you only belong to yourself. Don't be stuck with that impulse to simply pull into yourselves. Don't be enslaved by being trapped in oneself. But realize, and Paul, if you want to understand Paul, this is his basic idea that he found so radical in Jesus, that the truth is God chose us. We didn't choose God. We didn't claim God because we did the right things, or because we believed the right things, or because we said the right things, or that because we did the right things. Paul asserted that's law. But the truth of Jesus Christ is grace. And the essential part of grace, as this passage says, is that you were adopted by the Spirit. Now, adopted to me seems an odd word, but really, when you adopt someone, it's essential that you choose that person to be adopted. And Paul wants to assert God chose you. So you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to worry about the state of your soul. You don't have to live in fear that you're not doing the right things. You don't have to live in shame because you're imperfect, because God chose you. And because God chose you, there's an intimacy. It's not simply that God from some distant place, that your relationship to God is something distant or God's off in the universe. He even points out God chose you enough that God to you is Abba, which is not necessarily a term we probably would think of using God, which essentially is saying Dad, Papa. It's a term of intimacy that is far more profound than this distant God who judges us and who demands of us perfection. No, the Spirit leads us to an intimacy with God in which we are chosen. We belong to God. And Paul, in whatever words he puts it, he states it over and over again. God is who you belong to. That the Holy Spirit is the embodiment of God's grace. And then Paul, if you ever notice, spends a lot of time asserting because we belong to God, you know what? We belong to each other. And not only does he spend a lot of time talking about grace, he also spends a lot of time advising all the churches he's writing to remember, it's not because you believe the same things, it's not because you behave in the same way, but because we belong to God, we belong to each other. That church membership isn't simply some associational kind of volunteering. It's an assertion because of grace that we people in this sanctuary, we who are a part of each other, we belong to each other. Despite, as Paul will point out, our different ideas about things, about communion, about theology, even about politics, God forbid. Because by God's grace, that person sitting next to you belongs to you. So for Paul, the church is not simply some institution with rules or ideas, but people. People who realize they belong to each other. And they belong to each other not because they chose each other, but because we all belong to the one who chose us. And so Paul spends a lot of time in his letters talk about one anothering each other. Love one another, forgive one another, care for one another, support one another because we belong to one another. So in a day and age in which we often spend a lot of time trying to explore who we are, I think we forget that the most important part of that question of who we are, I think, can best be defined by who we belong to and who belongs to us. Reminded of that, I know many of you have heard me mention a theologian in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was arrested in the closing months of World War II because of his work with the community to try to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And this Lutheran pastor who had been a pacifist yet felt drawn to act in that particular time, found himself imprisoned, about to be killed by firing squad, final days of World War II before Germany fell. And Bonhoeffer, who was famous for his theological work, his emphasis on God's grace and our responsibilities in the midst of that grace, not known to be a poet, but he wrote a poem while he was in prison. And it's titled, "Who Am I?" And it chronicles in many ways his own struggle with identifying who he was. "Who am I?" he writes. "They often tell me I stepped from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. Who am I? They often tell me I used to speak to my warders freely and friendly and clearly as though it were mine to command. Who am I? They also tell me I bore the days of misfortune equably, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really that which other men tell of? Or am I only what I myself know of myself, restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat? Yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, tossing in expectations of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary, empty at praying, at thinking, at making, faint, and ready to say farewell to it all. So who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once, a hypocrite before others and before myself, a contemptible, woebegone weakling? Or is there something within me still like a beaten army fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. But whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.